No way human can survive that. Not without armor, the words hung in the air like a challenge. The alien students exchanged uneasy glances, their eyes fixed on the figure standing in the middle of the training ground. It was a human, bare-chested, with not a shred of protective gear around him, holographic. Dummy spun and flickered, waiting to spring into action. The training instructor, a hulking tier rule with a thick ridge running down his back, sneered. Begin the drill, he barked. The lights flickered, and the holograms activated in an instant. Each one represented a different threat, a slashing blade, a spear thrust, or the crushing force of an energy hammer. Any ordinary cadet would have strapped on the best armor available and hoped for the best. But this human, he stood there with a calm, almost bored expression. The first attack came from his left, a spearhead darting toward his side. The human twisted with such fluid motion that it seemed like he had anticipated it before the drill even began. His hand shot out, snatching the shaft of the holographic spear and yanking it forward, using its own momentum to propel the simulation's wielder off balance. A few of the alien students gasped. This wasn't how the drill was supposed to go. It was designed to overwhelm, to expose weaknesses in a soldier's defense. Yet the human treated it as though he was swatting flies. One of the alien students, a skittish wreath named VOR, whispered to his companion, "How is he doing that? I heard humans need armor just to handle their own environments." His friend, a gray-scaled Salon, could only shake his head. It's madness. He's not wearing any of the protection required for this simulation. The kinetic force alone should be enough to incapacitate him. In the center of the chaos, the human moved like a dancer in a storm. The second ATT attack came from above, a mace swung downward with enough simulated force to shatter bones. He sidestepped and drove his fist into the hologram's midsection. The light-based construct flickered, simulating a disabling strike. A murmur rippled through the observing students. This drill was meant to assess combat readiness, not a show of bravado. Yet here he was dismantling it with nothing but bare skin and instinct. The Turu instructor crossed his arms, his eyes narrow. He had trained some of the galaxy's most elite soldiers, but this display was unlike anything he'd witnessed. He'll slip up soon, he muttered under his breath, and when he does, he'll be on the ground. But the human didn't slip up. If anything, he sped up. The attacks came at him faster now, holograms spinning and striking with lethal precision. He ducked under a blade swing, stepped into the path of a second attack to nullify its force, and caught a hammer blow on his forearm, turning it aside with a flick of his wrist. That's impossible, VOR stammered, eyes wide. No creature should be able to react that quickly. Is he enhancing himself with some kind of implant? The Sirion shook his head, his eyes glued to the scene. I don't see any signs of augmentation. That's just him. A bead of sweat finally appeared on the human's brow, but it was from exertion, not fear. His muscles rippled with each movement, showcasing a raw, unfiltered power that made even the holograms seem like lesser threats. His eyes, however, remained cold and calculating. They flicked between each incoming strike, processing and reacting in the blink of an eye. Enough, the TR instructor's voice boomed, halting the drill. The holographic enemies froze and then faded out of existence, leaving the hum standing alone, breathing deeply, but unharmed. Impressive, the instructor grunted, stepping forward. But let's see how you handle a real weapon. He gestured to a weapons rack where various energy-based blades and blunt objects gleam. Pick one. The human turned his head slightly, glancing at the rack before returning his gaze to the instructor. Don't need one, he replied flatly. A chorus of disbelief erupted from the students. A combat drill without armor was insane, but rejecting a weapon, it bordered on suicidal. You mock this training, the troll growled. His pride stung. Do you think you're invincible? No. Rely on equipment to win. I rely on myself. The troll's eyes narrowed. Then let's see if your arrogance matches your skill. He gestured, and the holograms reactivated, this time in a full circle around the human. Blades, spears, maces, all pointed inward, ready to strike in unison. Start the advanced drill, the instructor ordered. The air seemed to hum with energy as the simulation ramped up. This was a test reserved for the most battle-hardened veterans. No one had ever completed it without injury, but the human didn't flinch. If anything, a faint hint of a smile touched his lips. The attacks came a maelstrom of violence. The human moved a blur of muscle and reflexes. He sidestepped, ducked, spun, and countered with an efficiency that made the holograms appear sluggish. His hands shot out, striking a spear shaft, sending its point off course. He pivoted, avoiding a blade swipe by mere millimeters before sweeping the legs out from another. Assailant, the students were speechless. This wasn't combat, it was art. Each move was executed with a precision that bordered on perfection, as if he had memorized every possible attack pattern and adapted to them all at once. The drill continued relentless. The human never slowed his movements, grew more aggressive, countering. Not just defensively, but offensively. He disarmed one hologram, then used its simulated weapon to knock another off balance. Before discarding it entirely, his bare fists and feet were more than enough. Vol's mouth hung open. How is he not dead? The Scion beside him shook his head, disbelief at across face. He's a Deathworlder. What do you expect? The silence among the alien students was suffocating. The human continued to dismantle the simulation, moving faster, fiercer, his strikes carried at controlled fury that the onlookers found difficult to comprehend. The holograms designed to simulate some of the galaxy's deadliest warriors crumbled before him. This was not just physical strength, it was the result of a mind hunt for combat. Vo clutched his hands together, his pale skin glistening with nervous sweat. This isn't normal. How can they function like this without armor, without anything? His voice trembled, reflecting the fear brewing in the minds of the other students. It's like he doesn't even need protection. The Sirion beside him muttered, I've read reports about their world Earth. The gravity, the predators, the diseases, it's a miracle they're even alive. They're bred for survival. That Vu pointed with a shaky hand at the human who now leapt into the air to avoid a low sweeping strike. He landed softly, already turning to meet another attacker. That's not just survival, that's something else. The troll instructor watched intently, his face betraying a mix of anger and admiration. This was beyond any training he had overseen. The human's refusal to use armor wasn't just bravado, it was a calculated move to demonstrate something deeper. A message, perhaps one that the alien students were starting to understand. Much to their horror, you're fighting against simulations, the troll called out to the human, his voice sharp. They follow patterns, but patterns can be broken. The human didn't respond with words. Instead, he pivoted to the side, narrowly avoiding it. Spear thrust and retaliating with an elbow strike that disrupted the hologram's program, causing it to flicker and reset. The students gasped. Patterns. The human was improvising, adapting to every new scenario the simulation threw at him. He's not following a routine, the Scion observed, his eyes wide. He reacting like he's predicting what's coming next. Impossible. Vo snapped his nerves. Frang, no one can predict random combat scenarios that fast. Then what do you call that? The Sirion gestured to the human as he ducked beneath a spinning blade and redirected an energy hammer with his forearm. His skin was marked with light bruises and scrapes, but they only added to the sense of raw, unfiltered capability that radiated from him. The drill intensified. Holograms emerged two at a time, attacking in tandem, aiming to overwhelm him through sheer numbers. The human shifted his stance, his movements becoming sharper, almost brutal. He lunged forward, landing a strike on one opponent's neck, while simultaneously sweeping the legs out from another. Adjust simulation difficulty to maximum, the Tro ordered, his voice tight with frustration. Let's see if you can keep up. The air crackled with energy as the holograms recalibrated, glowing brighter, their weapons whirling faster. These were no longer mere training exercises. They now represented the highest level of combat scenarios used to test elite forces. Most soldiers would have collapsed under the pressure by now, but the human, he surged forward, meeting the challenge head-on. A holographic sword slashed toward his neck. He leaned back just enough to avoid the blade grabbing the wrist of the attacker and yanking it downward. In the same fluid motion, he brought his knee up, striking another hologram in its midsection. The students' eyes widened as they watched the human transform into a whirlwind of violence. Vol's hands trembled. This is madness. He's going to get himself killed, but he didn't. The human moved as though the threats around him were extensions of his own mind, predicting and responding before any hit could land with real force. There was an eerie confidence in every movement, an unspoken statement that the simulation was merely a playground to him. The troll's eyes narrowed enough. He bellowed, deactivate the simulation. The holograms froze and then flickered out of existence, leaving the human standing in the center, his chest heaving. His body was marred with light bruises and shallow cuts, but he remained upright, eyes steady. For a moment, the only sound was the hum of the deactivated equipment. The instructor approached him, his heavy footsteps echoing in the stunned silence. You prove a point, he growled. But tell me, human, what do you gain by refusing armor by facing these drills with bare skin? The human wiped a trickle of sweat from his brow. Breathing steadily, armor is a tool, he replied, his voice calm but firm. But tools can fail training the body. And mind is the only true preparation. The TR raised an eyebrow. You claim your mind and body are enough to overcome the galaxy's threats? No. The human answered bluntly, but it gives me an edge when things go wrong. I can rely on myself, not on technology that can break or fail. The students exchanged uneasy glances, processing his words. They had been taught that armor, weapons, and technology were the pinnacles of combat effectiveness, yet here stood a creature who had just proved that raw skill honed by relentless training and an unbreakable will could match and even exceed their most advanced simulations. Vo shook his head, his mind racing. This changes everything if they can fight like that without protection. What are they capable of with full gear? The Syrian nodded slowly, eyes locked on the human. I don't know, he muttered, but I don't think I want to find out. The TR instructor, sensing the unease among his students, turned to address them. Remember this day. Remember what you have seen here. You face a species that thrives on overcoming challenges without relying on the crutches you've grown used to. He paused, casting a glance at the human who stood silently staring back at the gathered aliens. War is not about who has the best technology, the troll continued. It's about who can adapt, who can endure, and who can push beyond their limits. The human's eyes flickered with a silent intensity, and for the first time the students glimpsed what made these so-called Deathworlders truly terrifying. This was not a being shaped by comfort or convenience. This was a creature forged by adversity, one who had learned to rely on himself when every other advantage had been stripped away. The human stood, the sweat drying on his skin. As he looked out at the row of alien students, he saw fear in their eyes, yes, but also something else: respect, perhaps even a hint of admiration. They had just witnessed him tackle one of the galaxy's most intense combat simulations without armor, without hesitation. It was a statement. As much as it was a demonstration, the Taru instructor remained silent for a long moment. His gaze locked onto the human, weighing his next words carefully around him. The alien students fidgeted, exchanging whispers and furtive glances. This was not how they had expected the day to go. The drill was supposed to break the human, to show that even the fiercest species had their limits, but instead it had only emphasized the opposite, that humans were unpredictable, dangerous, and relentless. Finally, the troll turned to the gathered students. You have witnessed combat. You have learned tactics, he began, his deep voice carrying across the training ground. But none of that means anything if you cannot adapt. This human has shown you a simple truth: strength comes not from what you wear, but from what you are. VOR. His eyes wide and unblinking, raised a shaky hand. Instructor, what does this mean for the war? The question hung in the air like a cold mist wrapping itself around the crowd. The troll looked to the human, who met his gaze with that same unnerving calm. The instructor nodded as if acknowledging an unspoken truth. It means, the troll replied slowly, that our expectations need to change. We have seen today what a human is capable of, and I suspect that this is but a fraction of what they can do. When pushed, the human crossed his arms, the faintest hint of a smirk playing on his lips. You think this is impressive? He asked, his voice carrying a touch of sarcasm. You should see what happens when we actually fight. That simple statement caused a ripple of alarm among the students. The combat drills they had just witnessed were at their core simulated exercises. What would it mean if this human and others like him entered a real battlefield with weapons and armor? Would their technology even matter? The tail instructor shook his head, exhaling sharply. Enough theory, he muttered, turning to the human. Let's find out then. One final test with real stakes. The alien students gasped. Instructor, are you serious? The Syrian blurted out. He's shown what he can do alone. The TRU cut in sharply. Now we will see how he handles a direct confrontation against a real opponent. No more simulations. The human's expression didn't change, but his eyes glinted with interest. So, you're sending one of your own against me without armor? No, the TR replied, stepping forward. You will face me and I will be armed. Murmurs swept through the students. This was unprecedented. The TR instructor was a seasoned warrior, a veteran of countless battles, and now he was going to face a human barehanded. It was madness. Or perhaps a final effort to reclaim some semblance of pride after the human's shocking performance. The instructor picked up a training spear from the weapons rack. its surface glinting under the lights. He adjusted his grip and assumed a combat stance. Ready yourself, he growled. The human's muscles tensed, his stance shifting subtly. His eyes locked onto the instructor, calculating this was not a hologram with pre-programmed moves. This was a living, breathing opponent, one who would not hold back, and yet the human looked at ease, as if this were just another training exercise. With a burst of speed that belied his size, the Troll lunged forward, spear aimed at the human's midsection. The students held their breath somehow, expecting to see the human finally fall, finally make a mistake. But he didn't. In one fluid motion, the human sidestepped, his hands shooting out to grab the spear shaft, using the instructor's momentum against him. The human twisted the weapon, wrenching it from the Troll's grasp. Before anyone could process what was happening, the human spun around, swinging the spear in a wide arc that stopped mere inches from the instructor's throat. Silence fell over the training ground. The Troll stood motionless, eyes locked on the spear hovering at his neck. The human, still breathing steadily, tossed the weapon aside, letting it clatter to the floor. It's not about strength, the human said calmly. It's about using what's available, adapting to the situation in a real fight. It's not about who has the best armor or the sharpest blade. It's about who can survive. The Taru instructor slowly nodded, the tension draining from his face. And you, human, are built for survival more than any of us. He glanced at the students, who still stood in stunned silence. This lesson today is not just about combat. It's about understanding the nature of your enemy. Underestimating a human, he paused, his gaze sweeping over the crowd, is the last mistake you will ever make. The human turned to leave, his part in this demonstration seemingly over. But as he walked away, Vo called out, his voice cracking with barely contained anxiety. Wait, what are you saying? Are you are humans unbeatable? The human stopped, looking back over his shoulder. No, he replied simply. We can be beaten, but you'll have to work for it, because while you're calculating odds, measuring your weapons, and adjusting your armor, we're already moving, and once we start, we don't stop until we win. The words settled like a weight in the air, their meaning sinking deep into the minds of the alien students. This was not just bravado, it was a truth spoken by a species that had clawed its way up from a harsh world, enduring trials that would break most civilizations. As the human left the training ground, the TR instructor stepped forward to address the students one final time. This war will test us in ways we've never imagined. The humans may not be invincible, but they are relentless. They fight not just with their weapons, but with their very being. Remember this: the next time you face a human on the battlefield, know that you are up against more than just muscle and bone. You are up against a will that refuses to break them. Students nodded, their faces grim with newfound understanding. The human had shown them something today, a glimpse of what awaited them in the war to come, and as they filed out of the training grounds, each of them knew that whatever came next, they would never forget the sight of a Deathworlder standing unarmed, facing down threats that should have been his doom, yet emerging victorious.